Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
Tonight's panel is on the art of writing about food, and I'll introduce the panelists who are here. So Megan Myers, to my left, is a freelance writer, editor, event planner, and efficiency specialist. Her food blog, Steaded, is about navigating a world of temptation to live a balanced life. On her blog, she weaves the story of her life from memories of the past to day-to-day musings into her recipes, and she reflects on how we are always drawn back into the comforting culture of food. Her work has appeared in the Austin American Statesman, Edible Austin, Hobby Farms Magazine, the San Jose Mercury News, Lifehacker, BuzzFeed, the Huffington Post, Recipe.com, and other locations. Please give a warm welcome to Megan Myers. Eric Silverstein is the founder of Austin's The Peach Tortilla. A former litigator, he decided to pursue a different career path and marry his passions of food and business. Eric was born in Tokyo, Japan, where he was heavily influenced by Japanese, Chinese, and Malaysian cuisine. At the age of 10, Eric moved to Atlanta, Georgia, where he was introduced to traditional Southern cuisine. These divergent flavors and cuisines serve as the backdrop for the Peach Tortilla's menu. In 2012, Restaurant Hospitality recognized Eric as one of the new stars of street food. He was recently featured in People magazine and was named one of the top 30 up-and-coming chefs in America by Plate magazine. The Peach Tortilla is releasing its first cookbook in May 2019. In addition to recipes, the cookbook details Eric's journey from food truck owner to restaurateur. Please welcome Eric Silverstein. And last but not least, Mary Helen Speck's first novel, Migratory Animals, was an editor's choice by the New York Times Book Review and the Austin American Statesman, an Indie Next Pick, and an Apple iBook selection. Migratory Animals also won the Texas Institute of Letters Best First Fiction Award and a Writers League of Texas Book Award for Fiction. A past Fulbright Scholar to Nigeria and Dobie Paisano Writing Fellow, Speck teaches creative writing at St. Edward's University. Texas Monthly has named her one of 10 writers to watch. Please welcome Mary Helen Speck. I wanted to start with a question that isn't directly about writing, but it's the question that my favorite food podcast, Radio Cherry Bomb, you should check that out if you're not familiar with it. Their cookbook is over there, always starts their podcast with. And they're not specifically a writing podcast, but they do primarily talk to cookbook authors or people who have just happened to write about food. So the question I wanted to start with so that we can kind of get a sense of who each of our panelists is, because I think so much of how we write about food is who we are and where we come from. And that question is, what food culture did each of you grow up in? Where did you grow up? And was food always a big part of your daily life, or did it come to you later? We'll start with Megan first.
So I grew up in Wisconsin in the 80s and 90s, and food was not a big deal in my family. It was kind of like, it needs to be on the table because my dad worked shift work, my mom worked part-time. It wasn't a big focus. And so for me, I didn't realize that necessarily that food could be something else when I was a kid. And so once I got out of the house, that's kind of more when I discovered what cooking could actually be, and you could make it my own thing. My parents didn't have like their signature recipes that I learned from or anything like that. I didn't learn from my grandparents. I did sort of teach myself a little bit when I was a kid from recipes that came in the Sunday newspaper coupon circular.
Yeah.
I don't know if they still put recipes on those coupons anymore, but every Sunday I would clip out recipes and be like, I'm going to make this Lipton soup mixed potatoes because that sounds so innovative to me. So that's kind of like where I come from with that. You know.
So at what point did you as an adult kind of start to feel like, or was it were you more like a teenager or?
It was more when I became a mother.
Gotcha.
And I had to think about what I was feeding my own kids and realize that it is really important what I'm putting on the table. And I got my first CSA from Johnson's Backyard Garden, and I didn't know what anything was because vegetables to me came in a can when I was a kid. And so that's kind of how I taught myself how to cook, just looking at what the vegetable was and figuring out what to do with it.
Yeah, I love that so much. I feel like CSAs are just the best for pushing you as far as cooking.
It's a great starting point.
You'll need to give us some of those kohlrabi recipes.
Eric, what about you?
So, I mean, like you had mentioned, I was born in Tokyo, and but I'm not Japanese, and so that was kind of a unique experience. My mom's Chinese, and I lived in Japan for 11 years. So for 11 years, all I knew was living in Tokyo, which has a very robust food culture. And our family always loved food. I grew up eating Chinese food at home, very traditional Chinese food, and then went out and ate a lot of Japanese food in Tokyo. In the meantime, we were traveling to Singapore and all around Indonesia and stuff. So that food culture very much shaped me early on in life. And then we moved to the States when I was 11, and I had a different experience living in the South in Atlanta and spent 6 years there. And so for those that have been to our restaurant, it's very much a mix mash of different food cultures. And honestly, that's because that's what I was exposed to. You know, having lived in Japan with a Chinese mom and an American dad and living in Atlanta and kind of hopping around a lot. But food has always been important. It's something, you know, dinner was something I had with my family every day. You know, it was something that we gather around the dinner table and eat a meal that was prepared by my mom. And my dad's been in the restaurant business. My mom's family's in the restaurant business. So food is, I guess you could say it's in my blood in terms of, you know, the food business, the restaurant business.
So how did you, we'll talk about your writing aspect of it,
Sure.
of course, later, but how did you make the transition? You were a lawyer, a litigator. How did you end up, I'm sure this is a very long story, but the SparkNotes version, how did you end up in the restaurant business?
Very simply, I quit my job, but I was a terrible attorney. I mean, most people would probably tell you that. I had no business really being a lawyer. I was there because I was in too deep and couldn't get out, meaning I was already in my first year of law school. I'd already spent $50,000 on education for 1 year. I wasn't going to quit then, and I had to work my way out, pay off my debt, and then do something else. But my passion was always in food and was always in being an entrepreneur and owning my own business. And when I was 27, I was reading Bon Appetit magazine. I was watching YouTube videos of Roy Choi cooking out of a food truck. The passion was there. So ultimately, it was just, am I going to take a risk and do a U-turn on my entire life? And so, it's as simple as, you know, writing a business plan and telling the managing partner of my firm I'm quitting my job and packing up our 2 cars, you know, my girlfriend and I, and moving to Austin. That's really how it happened.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. Mary Helen, what about you? What was your food history like?
So I grew up in Abilene in West Texas, and my history was a little bit closer to Megan's in the sense that, you know, at least back in the 80s, Abilene was more or less kind of a food desert except for maybe barbecue. And so I remember there was an Indian restaurant that opened when I was like 10, and I think it lasted like 3 months. You know, it was like too adventurous. And so it wasn't really until I left home, went to college, and then for a lot of my 20s that I started getting exposed to really interesting, you know, my first bowl of pho, what is this sushi thing. I remember in college getting made fun of because I referred to some sort of French restaurant as Chez Marc. You know, and I just never had heard that pronounced in French. And then later I ended up, you know, traveling and getting kind of more connected to food as it kind of was reflected in travels. I think ultimately, I would say like my most adventurous meal was goat brain in Nigeria, so which is like kind of a long way to go from Abilene, Texas, meat and potatoes.
So we'll talk now about how each of you started writing about food, and we'll go back to you, Eric. How did you decide that you wanted to write a cookbook?
Yeah. Originally, I wasn't planning on writing a book. I was approached by a literary agent who went to college with me at Washington University in St. Louis. That's where I went to undergrad. Mm-hmm. And she really liked my story, and she felt like I should write a memoir about my story because, you know, going from lawyer to food truck, and then there was a big struggle in between. So initially we were going to have it ghost written because I just didn't have the time to write the book. And pitch it as a memoir. Well, we pitched it for about 2 years, and the publishers kept saying, we don't want a memoir, we want a cookbook. So so she said, you want to write a cookbook? And I said, look, we've been doing this for 2 years now, pitching this, so what's another 1 or 2 years of pitching a cookbook? And I said, this time I'll write the cookbook. You know, I don't need a ghostwriter, because I was really unhappy with the tone and everything that the ghostwriter had written, and I just felt like if it's going to be my name on it, you know, I'm going to write the book. So we pitched a cookbook, and it eventually got picked up by Sterling Publishing, which is owned by Barnes and Nobles. And so right then and there, I was just telling Megan it took like 3 or 4 months for their lawyers to review our contract. And so once we finally had signed the contract, they were like, you got 3 months to write the book. And I was like, 3 months is not a lot of time. So we've been basically speed writing and speed cooking a book for the last 3 months. So I guess that's the long answer. I wasn't originally intending on writing a book, but once we got a deal, it was 100% effort moving forward.
I definitely want to talk about testing recipes if we have time later, because that sounds like a really fast turnaround for doing that, and then also writing it down in a cohesive way.
Yeah, I mean, we were doing. My wife's sitting up here. She helped me test a lot of them, but we're doing about 6 to 7 recipes a week.
Oh my goodness.
Every day.
Yeah.
Like come home, and try to cook at night, and yeah. I mean, we're testing everything.
So before writing the cookbook, did you have any writing experience other than litigation, or was this
I mean, I
completely
had
new?
written actually in college.
Okay.
I was actually a sports writer for the school paper, and so I would cover sports teams and go to the games and then do the write-up and then work with the editor and stuff like that. And then as a lawyer, you're actually writing quite a bit, because I was a litigator, so we'd write a lot of briefs and a lot of memos to partners and stuff like that. So I was always writing something, but it was not in the capacity of a cookbook, certainly. And writing recipes is a very different deal than writing something like a memoir. It's a little more dry, and it's more, I don't know, it's kind of more like math, to be honest with you. It's very
That's true, yeah.
But we have a memoir side to the cookbook too, so that was a little more fun to write.
Yeah. Megan, what about you? You mentioned that you got more interested in food as you were cooking for your kids. How did that interest translate into your blog?
So I actually started my blog, in 2006, so 12 years ago, I guess. And it wasn't about food to start out with. It was an extension of my live journal, if anyone remembers live journal. So it wasn't about food at all. And then kind of once I had my first son, I started thinking more about what people were going to eat, and I discovered food blogs. I discovered Smitten Kitchen.
Oh, I love Smitten Kitchen so much.
And Homesick Texan. Those are my first 2 blogs that I love. And discovered that you could write about food, and I didn't really care if people read it or not. It's just kind of my journal of what I was doing with the CSA, and it kind of just developed from there. It wasn't anything that I thought about making money on or going past having it be a blog. I had a day job as a copy editor, so...
Is that where the name of your blog comes from?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to explain what the title of your blog means for people who might not know?
So my blog is called Steaded, and if you don't know anything about editing, a stet is the mark that you make if you want to not make an edit. It's 3 little dots. So that's because I wasn't thinking about food at the time that I made my blog. It makes no sense now for a food blog. But
I feel like it does, though. I feel like in the description for your website, you've kind of spun it.
I made it
in a way that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. But I have to explain it every time, and it works sometimes in my favor and sometimes not.
You started out just writing the blog for almost like a journal.
Mm-hmm.
When did you get to the point, and I'm sure this is also potentially a long answer, of wanting to do that as more of a job and something you might want to do professionally?
So it's kind of, with having the blog, getting on social media and meeting other people that were writing about food, basically everyone that I know that's my friend now, I met on social media. Every job that I got is because of my blog, actually. So my blog ended up serving sort of as a portfolio for writing about food. I didn't really think about what I would do with it other than writing for fun, because while my degree was in journalism, I wasn't thinking about it like that, because I felt like already back then, even in 2008, the market was already getting saturated with blogs. They were brand new. It was getting really crazy, really fast. So I kind of stepped back a little. And it was more just a thing for myself. And then I can't even remember. I think it was because someone that I met online who wrote a blog that was a collaborative blog reached out to me and said, hey, I need more collaborators. Do you want to write for this blog? And I was like, oh my God, someone noticed me. I want to, of course I will. And then it just kind of spiraled from there. Someone who read that blog reached out to me to write for recipe.com. I joined the Austin Food Blogger Alliance, and because of that, I met someone who worked for Whole Foods, and I got a job at Whole Foods, and it just kind of kept going from there.
So all really just kind of continuing to put yourself out there and just be authentic on your blog. It sounds like it just kind of snowballed.
Yeah, a lot of bloggers go for they want a brand out there and their specific personality, but for me it was more just about being an extension of myself and not necessarily selling a particular thing. I just wanted to make sure that I was doing something good with good content and having it work out for me whichever way it went, because I felt that was more authentic.
Makes sense. So for you, Mary Helen, you're our novelist on the panel, and I was trying to think of someone who wrote fiction, and I could not remember exactly what it was about your book, Migratory Animals, that it had to do with food, but I just had this very strong memory because I'd read it about 2 years ago that there was a lot of food in there. And then I opened the book to a page, and literally there's a description of chopping eggplant right on that page when I opened it. And then as I read your Modern Love column and other things that you'd written, I noticed that food really has been kind of a focus for you. Was that intentional, or has that just kind of come about accidentally?
It was not really intentional. I think I would say kind of two things. First of all, for me, food is a great kind of objective correlative in fiction. So T.S. Eliot has this term, at least the way I think about it, understand it, is when you are trying to explore something in the fictional world, whether or not it's abstract or subtext, finding something that's like concrete that can express that you can dramatize is really important. And I think food is just kind of an amazing way to do that. You know, if a cook or character is really persnickety in the kitchen, that tells you about the personality. Obviously, we can think about food in terms of culture, in terms of the generation, in terms of class, in terms of relationships, how the characters are cooking for each other, or how they're eating together. So for me, it's just kind of a great way to kind of dramatize other aspects in terms of what's going on with the characters. And I think the first time I ever really thought about that in a more kind of conscious way was when I was in graduate school. One of my great friends was a food writer, and she did a short story that was entirely recipes, and it's basically recipes of meals that one character cooked for another character in the arc of their the kind of rise and fall of their relationship. So you get kind of you have to kind of deduce what happened in the relationship just based on these recipes. And just the fact that she could tell so much just with that, that was the first time I kind of really started kind of thinking more concretely about how I was using food to do more than just kind of the sensory aspects of a scene.
Has that short story been published? It sounds amazing.
It has. I'll have to go.
Yeah.
I think it was back in the day with literary journals, though, weren't mostly online,
No.
and so I'll have to see if it's gotten put up online.
If they do, we'll share it on our Facebook page because that sounds really, really fascinating. I feel like our culture in the past several years, past decade, really seems to be fixated on stories about food. Why do you guys think that is?
Well, I mean, food's really personal because everyone has to eat.
Yeah.
It's literally like you can't live without eating. And we all have memories of food. Like, even though my family didn't really cook, there would be the one recipe, which is like beef stew. That's the one recipe to me. That's like my family thing, even if it's not our family recipe. So it just speaks to home to me. And I feel like a lot of it's tied into your memories of how you grew up, or your first date with somebody, or anything like that. There's just a lot of feeling tied into it because it's so ingrained in your everyday life.
You know, as a society, we're more knowledgeable now about what we're eating, and so that's a bigger topic. But more so than that, I think food in general has just become a little more relevant as in the last 5 or 10 years. You turn on Netflix, there's a lot more food documentaries. There's a lot more celebrity chefs. It's cool to talk about food. It's cool to eat at the newer restaurants. And I've seen a definite rise in that in the last 10 years. And like Megan touched on, we all have to eat. We all have to cook every day. It's the same answer as to why does everyone think they're a food critic on Yelp? Because they can cook a meal at home, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think that's just people identify with food that way.
Yeah, I feel like that sense of identity, it's really become me more entwined with, you know, like in thinking of what you wear, you're also trying to kind of present a certain kind of image. And I think a couple of the characters in my book, they are not doing this consciously, but they, in a sense, are kind of using food to show that they are kind of jumping class in a certain sense. They're becoming more kind of cosmopolitan in terms of the kind of foodie culture that they get involved in. And another one of my characters in this book is has kind of quit his job in the tech kind of world and started a farm, which I think also kind of speaks to the certain kind of idealism around food, maybe that sense of kind of more of a romantic kind of notion of not wanting factory farms and wanting to kind of to feel like we're kind of closer to the land in a sense, and to actually knowing what vegetables looked like. I think one of my roommates in college, I remember she was at one point eating and she's like, wait, you know, I don't know if pickles grow on trees or if they come out of the ground. And, you know, it's just like we were so kind of disconnected from where our food came from. I think there's anyway, so I think it's kind of interesting on both of those kind of levels in terms of an increased kind of interest in using food in terms of identity, in terms of expression.
Yeah, and with that, how do you all feel about the way that social media, particularly visual parts of social media, have changed the way that we tell stories about food?
I feel like that's a very loaded question.
It is.
We could talk about it the whole time. I mean, I would say good and bad.
Yeah.
Because the good is that it gets a lot of things out there. Like Eric and I were talking earlier about how he remembers my tweets from forever ago. So like I know as a restaurant from a long time ago, social media, but a lot of the times now I feel like it gets so obsessed about the perfect image, and it's not necessarily about what you're actually showing people. It's less about the story now.
Right.
And I don't know. I don't know if that's good or bad.
Yeah.
Because it depends on your opinion. But
As a business, you know, we interact with social media quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I mean, we have no choice but to, because it's marketing, you know.
And it's connections too.
It
I
is.
mean, you do meet communities.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny. That's my social media manager taking photos. So these aren't food photos, so. But I mean, I think people have taken advantage of social media a little bit. You know, I can't tell you how many requests we get where it's like, hey, I have X amount of Instagram followers. I don't know if they're paid for or not, and so how about we come in and shoot a couple photos and you give us a meal on us. So now we're not doing it so much for the love of food or for the love of culture or anything like that. We're just doing it. This is my job to take photos of food, and can you give me a free meal kind of thing. So.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's clouded my lens quite a bit in terms of how I view social media and people that shoot food. But, you know, I think our ability to get our food out there, our product out there,
Yeah.
it's tremendous, you know. It's something we have to do.
I guess from a more personal take, since I don't come from the food industry, I think it's interesting. And maybe this is kind of over, but there was that whole period where everyone was taking pictures of themselves with their meals on their Facebook pages. And to me, that's like a really interesting thing, because it's both like wanting to show the world this interesting meal I had, but also wanting to associate the fact that they are at the restaurant, like kind of what you were talking about earlier, or they had access to this particular food. So I think that's kind of an interesting, like food is like a currency, like a
Yeah.
social currency that kind of comes through in that way. But
Actually, we'll kind of switch gears a little bit. And Mary Helen, if you wanted to, I kind of surprised Mary Helen with a passage from her book that I wanted her to read, because I feel like it's really evocative. It is a piece of fiction, but I think that the way that you use food in this piece is applicable to any storytelling that you do with food.
So I'll just quickly kind of give it a little background. This character, Brandon, he's abroad in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is where his family originally came from. living with a family there. And this is kind of a flashback to when he's younger. After a hike to the Beckel waterfall one afternoon, Brandon returned to the stone house to find his host mother crying as she chopped aubergines into cubes on her work table. He fell in beside her, slicing green peppers and potatoes, knowing better than to ask. The lives of Kurdish people were full of things to cry about. Maybe she cried for when they were mustard gassed, or for when they were massacred and forced from their homes. Maybe it was for the sons killed or the daughters disappeared. The knife was awkward in Brandon's hand, and his vegetable pieces all funky and oblong. But as Brandon and his host mother stewed vegetables and kneaded dough, and as the light slanted through the rough rectangular windows, turning everything a pale gold, the woman, her long hair tied back in a flowery scarf, began to sing. Brandon tapped a rhythm out with his foot. They said nothing. By the time the Topsy was prepared and the family, which normally annoyed Brandon with their loud talk and strange manners, was sitting around the table sopping up the spicy sauce with thick slices of naan, his host mother was smiling again. So was he.
Part of the reason I wanted you to read that instead of me is that I was afraid I would cry because I just find that scene so beautiful, that there's just this sadness, and then in the process of preparing a meal together, both of them find this connection and this happiness. And I was curious how did you write that scene? And as you kind of were writing other scenes in your book where you use food as a way to talk about connections or community or family, are those memories actually your memories, or are you kind of doing research perhaps on what would have been eaten in that village and kind of going from there?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a mix in terms of things that I might have experienced and things that I've researched. And actually, that's another thing, if you want to talk about food and social media and food and the internet age, is it makes it so much easier. I can go on YouTube and figure out how somebody makes something that I've never actually, seen prepared, or you can get a lot more information in terms of food preparation all over the world. But this character, Brandon, in the future, well, actually in the present of the novel, in his 30s, he's very into food and into cooking, and has this kind of particular cultural background. And so really it was in kind of fleshing out him as a character that kind of led me to that scene. It's not something I had personally experienced.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But trying to kind of figure out how food became important to him, and how he kind of uses it in his life, and kind of moving backward in time for him. I kind of ended up coming up with that.
Yeah, and then Eric, for you, as you write your memoir, or the portions of the book that are memoir as well as cookbook, how are you kind of coming to the memories that you're deciding to include in the book? And I'm just curious, too, how it's formatted in terms of the recipes. Is each recipe a memory, or is it just kind of mixed in with the story?
Well, we kind of broke the book down, so there's a section of the book where I talk about a lot of my mom's Chinese food that influenced me growing up as a kid. And so in that memoir, in that area of the book, I really focus on what it was like growing up in Japan, my kind of having an identity crisis, so to speak, in terms of me personally, because my parents had sent me to a Japanese preschool. And, I decided I wanted out because I wasn't Japanese. And really having dinner at home, having my mom's Chinese food, having her cook. I remember her vividly hosting dinner parties and cooking all day, and me wanting to be in the kitchen and help her and making dumplings with her. And so all those early influences as a kid really, I was able to get a lot of recipes out of that I'd either run through the restaurant or cook at home and put those in an area of the book. And then there's a chapter in the book which really focuses on Japanese street food and believe it or not, American fast food that's been transformed for the Japanese palate. And so I have vividly remember my parents taking me to eat fast food as a kid, and at Kentucky Fried Chicken, because my dad worked for Kentucky Fried Chicken, and this concept called Moss Burger. And these are all very vivid memories I had that really shaped, I guess kind of what and how I identify food with. Yeah.
What is Moss Burger?
It stands for, it's a terrible name, but it stands for Mountain, Ocean, and Seas. And
Cool.
so it's a Japanese burger concept but they do stuff like the original Moss burger, it has like a miso meat sauce, and then they do like a teriyaki burger. So it's kind of like fusion. And yeah, so a lot of the concepts there, they serve American fast food, but then they fuse it with Japanese flavors.
So with the other part of the cookbook, which is recipes, and we started to talk about recipe testing earlier, and you mentioned that recipe is kind of like, it's basically like math, and anyone's welcome to jump in on this question too. What are the elements in your mind of a good recipe?
I mean, look, I had to really rethink how I was approaching this book, because this book is meant for anybody in this room to be able to come in and make these recipes. I've bought cookbooks where I was like, holy shit, I can't make this recipe, you know? And I think that's a problem. And so I want everyone to feel comfortable. So I really forced myself to, if I wrote a recipe, I was going to go to a grocery store. I was going to go to Central Market. I was going to go buy everything, make sure I could find all this stuff, and then execute the recipe at home. I wasn't going to try and test this recipe at my commercial kitchen. I was going to do it at home. I was going to do it with the equipment I had on hand. I wasn't going to go out and buy a bunch of things. And so I think a good recipe, one, you know, it makes sense. You can follow it. The steps are approachable. And really, I mean, I think approachability is the key, right? Like, everyone should be able to do it. And I think a lot of people get turned off with cookbooks that there's too many steps. There's too many sub-recipes. If you have one recipe and then there's 3 sub-recipes, I think you lose 90% of your readers. And so that was the approach we were taking. Like, hey, we'll throw some hard recipes in here, but for the most part, let's make this thing accessible. Otherwise, it's really just going to be a coffee table book, you know, where people are looking at the photos.
Right. Megan, what about for you and your blog? What are the elements of a good recipe for you?
I would agree with approachability, basically. I hate long recipes with long ingredient lists. Ones with specialty ingredients to some extent. Like, I shop at Whole Foods, I shop at specialty stores, but I want my readers to be able to find those ingredients too, to make it easier for them. I feel like you have to write your recipe as though the person that is cooking has possibly never cooked before, ever, which sounds like you may be dumbing it down too much. But there's so many things that when you are cooking every day and you're so into it, you don't realize that people don't know like what fold means.
Right.
So you have to explain that, or they don't understand what stiff egg whites means versus soft peaks.
That was literally just the example
Yeah.
I was going to give. Yeah.
So things like that you have to explain a little bit more than you would think you would normally would if you're speaking to somebody who is a frequent cookbook buyer or whatever. Blog readers are generally just home cooks. They just want a recipe that they can make quickly for their family. So you have to make it more approachable.
Right. So from the perspective of someone who's writing recipes and probably reading a lot of other people's recipes, are there any things you feel like particularly people who are newer to writing recipes sometimes, other than, you know, making it accessible, might forget to include, or just things that people who are very, very new to recipe writing themselves might want to keep in mind as far as how to format things or anything like that?
Proofreading. I've read there's lots of recipes where they forget a step or they forget an ingredient. So I'd say that's the number one thing. Always read your work and have someone else read it too. I have forgotten ingredients myself, and I've been doing this for years and years.
One of the kind of big debates, if you're someone who writes recipes, is who owns a recipe. So if you go onto someone's blog and you decide that you're going to make something, but you put your own spin on it, at what point can you actually say that it's yours, and then what are kind of issues around that?
Right. So that's what I was going to tie into, is that you can't just post someone else's recipe on your blog, and you can't just change. So the thing is that recipes are technically not copyrightable. The list of ingredients is not copyrightable. The method, your language that you use for your method is. So that makes it a little bit trickier in terms of stealing someone's recipe. When in doubt, the person should always credit the person. Just say, hey, I found this recipe on Homesick Texan. It's adapted. Or if it's not adapted, ask permission from the original person if you can post it on your site. There are lots of people who don't listen to that and just copy and put it on there because they figure no one's going to see it. But eventually, someone will see it.
One of the things that I feel like I remember reading, which not everyone agrees with, but Amanda Hesser of Food 52 said something along the lines of, once you've changed something like 3 ingredients, then it's now an original recipe. And that's another mathy kind of thing. You can also change the method, but I think it does, keeping in mind if you're not actually really changing the ingredients.
Yeah,
is it really
it's
yours?
really like loosey-goosey, because you can be like, I'm using 1 teaspoon of cinnamon instead of half a teaspoon. Now it's my recipe. I feel like if you're adapting someone's recipe, just say that you're adapting it, and it just solves a lot of problems.
Sure. What about you, Eric? Any other thoughts to add on recipe writing, or you, Mary Helen?
On how to write a good recipe?
Yeah.
I mean, I think just vetting it, making sure that your quantities make sense, making sure that the yields make sense. I mean, that was something that I went over and over again, because a lot of sub recipes, for instance, like let's say I have a burger, but then there's a sauce on that burger. Sometimes you can't make the sauce in such small quantities. You have to make it in a bigger quantity. So you have to alert the reader, like, hey, you're going to have extra sauce, but you can use it maybe on this other recipe in the book, or this recipe will hold and this sauce will hold for 7 days in your fridge. You can use it on something else. So I think just being cognizant of the fact that the reader doesn't run a restaurant. They're not going to blow through this product the next day. You can't just say, hey, serve it at next service, So just knowing that they're going to have some excess here and there, and advising them on what they can do with it. That's a big thing for me. And then also alerting the reader that, like for me, one big thing was oven temps. All ovens are different, Commercial ovens different than a home oven. Different home ovens function differently. So telling the reader, it may take 11 minutes, it may take 12 minutes. You got to look for these things, when you're roasting your vegetables and stuff like that. I think initially I was assuming that all home readers knew how to deep fry at home, and then I added
I tried it the other day, and it didn't go well.
Yeah. So then I added a whole section on how to deep fry at home, So just stuff like that, which I think we just took all assumptions off the plate.
How many times did you test the recipes for your book? I know it's different for different recipes, but
I mean, I was only doing them once, unless I screwed it up, and then twice. I mean, because these are all recipes I had done before.
Right.
Yeah. It was just trying to take them from a batch recipe back down into a home recipe.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Megan, for your blog? How rigorous of a testing process do you feel like is necessary for blogs?
I think it depends on the recipe. If you're posting something that is, like I post a lot of muffin recipes.
Right.
Muffins kind of all have the same base, so I usually just do one test of those. But I think that you have a due diligence to your reader to test things more than once, because I think if you're making it once and you're slapping it on your blog, that's not really a test. That's just you happen to make it. And if it turned out great, that's great. But I think you should do at least more than once. You reminded me, the other thing I was going to add was that you have to think about equipment and what the reader might have, because especially if you're doing baking, you're going to, say you're going to make a banana bread. Banana bread can be made in a metal pan, it can be made in a glass pan, it can be made in a ceramic pan, and it's going to turn out differently every single pan that you use. And so you have to take into account that the reader is not necessarily going to know what kind of pan to make, and they are going to either gloss over the instructions that you gave for that pan and just say, I have a loaf pan, it's going to work. And then they'll have 12 comments later complaining about your loaf pan not working. But so you have to account for, hey, there are other options. It might be different. Like he was saying, your oven's going to be different. If your pan's different, it's going to cook different, things like that.
Yeah. So switching gears slightly, Mary Helen, for you as a novelist, can you give examples of some fiction books, including your own, but also other than your own, where food is a focus and really well discussed?
Oh, so one that probably most people are familiar with is Alice in Wonderland. Talk about a great way to use kind of food. I think a lot of the kind of magical realists use food in a really interesting way as well, in that similar kind of way, like Water for Chocolate. There's this kind of amazing scene where she ends up kind of crying into the food, and then when everyone eats it later, they end up crying, and so it kind of takes on some of this kind of fantastical qualities of the food. To the Lighthouse, which is a Virginia Woolf novel, has kind of an amazing scene with Mrs. Ramsay making this kind of French meal that turns out perfectly, but everything in the family starts to not kind of like fall apart. And so it's this interesting kind of juxtaposition. It's a beautifully done scene. Amy Tan's Joy Luck Club is one that a lot of people probably have read that deals a lot with food that I thought was great. And then Babette's Feast is also kind of great because to me, it's about culture and communities and how those things can change, and food can kind of be a kind of agency for change. And that's kind of has this kind of great kind of climax scene around food. I mean, it's called Babette's Feast, so clearly that's kind of the main deal. So those are some ones that I feel like food is really acting as more than just a sensory kind of part of the setting, but is really doing something dynamic in the books.
Yeah, it's so interesting as I was thinking about how many books I love have such a focus on food in them. But there's also in nonfiction books, I have many, many examples over there. I saw someone downstairs, and I actually saw Megan, and I just had this huge crate of food books that I was carrying up here so you guys would have a lot of examples. There's food history, there's food journalism, there's personal essays around food, there's cookbooks. So I was just curious if the two of you, Megan and Eric, have any favorite food reads. They can be novels, they can be cookbooks that you love or have turned to.
I would say for cookbooks, I would say anything that Rob Walsh has done. Mm-hmm. There's so much history in there that I feel I like cookbooks where I can just sit down and read them like a regular book.
Is that the same Rob Walsh has the restaurant in?
Yes.
Yeah.
All of his cookbooks are just really informational, and I feel like I learned so much about Texas because I'm not from Texas, so I want to learn everything I can. What else? I mentioned Homesick Texan. I'm a friend of Lisa's, so I love her books anyway, but I can't really hard thinking of novels though for some reason.
You don't have to think of a novel.
I was thinking actually the book is not focused on food, but I recently reread A Wrinkle in Time.
Me too.
And I remember when I was a kid, that very first scene where they're making hot chocolate on the stove was amazing to me as a child, because hot chocolate was not made on the stove at my house. And immediately, the first chapter of the book, I was like, this is going to be an amazing book because they're making hot chocolate on the stove, and I don't know what this world is going to be like. That always stuck with me for the past 30 years.
Yeah. Eric, what about you? What are some favorites?
For me, one of the first books I had about a while ago was Tom Colicchio's Think Like a Chef, and that really, I've never read I don't read cookbooks in the sense from cover to cover, but I thought that was a really strong sort of book to just have. Lately, I really like the Momofuku cookbook, and I really like Danny Bowen's Mission Chinese cookbook because they do offer quite a bit of detail in terms of their history and how they started. And for me, that's very interesting, particularly David Chang's story, because he failed and had to, reconcept a couple times and figure it out. And so, even though I'm making food and I'm cooking, I also run a business. And so I find inspiration in that as well, and both those guys also push the envelope. So a lot of my reading and a lot of my inspiration is geared towards a lot of the modern day guys that, that came up right around 2008, 2009, that really shaped the industry, in my opinion, for the better in the last 10 years. I probably wouldn't be where I am today without them laying some of the groundwork.
Yeah. Any other favorites that have popped into our heads before we move on?
I was thinking of a memoir that I really liked that came out last year from David Leet, from Leet's Culinaria. It's not just about food; it's also about depression and stuff and anxiety and stuff. But he weaves food into it through his life, and it was a really beautiful read.
What's the title of that?
It's called Notes on a Banana, I believe.
Oh, I love that title. Yeah. So kind of continuing on with this theme of places to be reading, what about if you're interested in being a food writer? What are some good places to pitch?
Addie Broyles at The Statesman. She's been taking on some freelance writers lately, and so she's a good place to pitch. And she's wonderful. She's so nice. She really loves helping other writers. Edible Austin, of course, is a really great place to pitch. I would say look for other blogs, collaborative blogs. They don't always pay, but if you're just kind of looking to get the experience of writing about food, then that's a really good place to start.
Yeah. So for you, transitioning from blogging to writing for someone else, what was that like?
I liked it actually because I liked having the guidelines. I felt it was a little bit easier to write about a specific topic, knowing that they had a certain style to go for. It seemed like having a deadline and having guidelines made it easier overall. I feel like trying to do it yourself makes it more pressure, if that makes any sense. Like, it seems the opposite, but I really like the process.
Yeah. What is the process like for pitching? And we can, Eric and Mary Helen, talk too about pitching books, just briefly, just to kind of give people a taste of what that process is like. What's it like to pitch an article about food, and what should people remember to do or not do?
Not bother them incessantly, first of all. But make sure you read the publication that you are pitching to. You need to know what they write about. Make sure that you're not going to pitch them on a topic that they just wrote about last week. You don't necessarily have to read every back issue or anything like that, but be familiar with their style, be familiar with what they normally cover. You're not going to pitch Edible Austin on a topic about McDonald's. It would be super weird. So, I mean, maybe if they have a farm-to-table movement, who knows? Maybe they would. Make sure that you are pitching to someone that is actually going to be reading it, that's the right person to pitch to. In most magazines and websites, they have a place you can find that information. The magazine is in the inside front cover. Websites, usually just the contact page. They'll say if they accept pitches or not. Edible Austin, usually, I think they still do the same topic kind of for an editorial calendar. Yeah, it's like the same every 4 months or something like that. So it's easier to figure out what you would want to write for that. But yeah, just pay attention to what they're actually doing. Follow them on social media. You can get a lot of hints from following the publication or the specific person on social media. One person that I really like to follow is Helen Rosner on Twitter.
How do you spell that?
It's just Helen and then Rosner. I think her Twitter handle is just HELS. Oh. She is the food editor at the New Yorker now. She used to write for Saveur and then Eater, and now she's at the New Yorker. And they're putting out really great content there. So if you want to do more in-depth, awesome food writing, that'd be a good person to follow.
Awesome. Eric, what about you? You just spent, did you say about 4 years pitching books? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. For you, what do you feel like in a nutshell are things to do or not do if you're someone who wants to pitch a cookbook? Or memoir.
I mean, I think the most important thing is to understand that it is a business decision for publishers, and so they're looking for the marketability of a book, right? So obviously a lot of publishers feel that cookbooks are easier sells than memoirs. That was the first thing we learned. And then the second thing that my agent really focused on was trying to make sure that she showed them that we had national exposure and national appeal, and that we weren't so much regional, and that, you know, this book would sell more than 10,000 copies. Yeah. So I think, you know, the recurring terms from the publishing houses were, you know, we've got to consider your reach and our return on our investment. And so even though writing a book is such a passion project, it's still a business for these guys. And so I think knowing, you know, having an understanding of that really helps. And also certain publishers have, like Sterling has Sterling Epicure. And so that is, you know, specifically focused on food, you know, that division of Sterling. So pitching a publisher like Sterling made a lot of sense. Just knowing what kind of authors these publishing houses have worked with really helps. And if anyone's seriously interested, they should follow my agent. Her name is Jen Chen Tran, and she's on Twitter, and she tweets all the time about submissions she gets from prospective clients. And
she's coming to our conference in June.
Is she?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, she tweets and she doesn't hold back.
Yeah.
So I learn a lot from what she has to say. So,
Mary Helen, what about you? Any advice for pitching for novelists or for essays or short stories or anything like that? I know that's a big question. I know.
I guess I would just kind of reiterate what you were saying. I mean, if you're finding people who are doing something similar to what you're doing and figuring out who their agents and their editors and their publishers are. And I think a great way, at least in terms of for novels, is to look in the acknowledgments, because almost everybody acknowledges their agents and editors and publishers in their acknowledgments. So if you can often figure out kind of how they got their book published, and so if you find people doing something similar to what you are hoping to do, that's a good place to kind of start in terms of looking for those people.
What's one piece of advice that each of you would give to an aspiring writer, whether they're hoping to be a novelist or a food journalist or a cookbook author? We'll start with you, Megan.
The cliche is always to just keep writing. But I would say keep learning. I know you guys have your conference, and then there's also workshops around town. I recently went to a food writing workshop. It was in France, and it was amazing. It was with it was with Jamie Schler and Domenica Marchetti, and it was a small group, and I felt like I learned so much, even though I've been writing about food for a while now. It's just kind of like a way to reset your brain of what you're doing, and I think finding opportunities like that to help you keep learning is really, really important.
Eric, what about you?
I mean, one of the big things for me, one thing that was really important was I didn't want to lose my voice in this book. And so I wrote the book kind of like how I'm speaking with you right now, because I wanted the reader to have a real understanding of who I am, where I came from, my experiences, and, you know, if I had a 2 or 3 period where things got really dark, then I was going to tell you about it, you know, and let you know how I felt. And I wanted that to come through in the book. So for me, it was, you know, really, really writing with a sense of, you know, voice of who I really am as a person.
What about you, Mary Helen?
I would say one of the things I tell my students, actually I give my students an assignment to have to go ride a bus around Austin by themselves without their phone or any other kind of tablet or anything else, just to kind of, what do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? What do you overhear? What are you eavesdropping on to the people sitting next to you? And I find myself having the same issue, especially now that I'm a mom, constantly trying to like get things done, you know, checking emails while I'm doing something else. But I think as a writer, the more we do that, the more we lose out on the kind of sensory observations of the world that definitely make for good, vibrant writing, that sense of kind of being kind of checked out in terms of what's going on around us. So I would say take a cell phone break.
Yeah.
Or a tech break.
So the last question I'll ask before we adjourn, what are each of you working on right now? What can we look forward to from you in the next couple of months?
I'm not actually particularly working on any writing right now. I have a lot of side gigs that I do, so I'm kind of working on that. I hope in the future to be writing a cookbook, but it's kind of on the back burner right now.
Awesome.
The Peach Tortilla Cookbook comes out in May of 2019, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And we're also working on building a restaurant at the airport in front of Gate 7. That's not writing, but come check that out too.
I'm finishing up a novel set in New Mexico, a great food state. They even have the state question, which is red or green. So that is not really in my book, but the red and green sauces do make an appearance.
Thank you all so much. We have a bunch of cooking books over there, all different kinds, as well as Mary Helen's book and a lot of Austin books. Now please give our panelists a warm round of applause.
This has been the Writers League of Texas podcast. For more information about the Writers League of Texas and our many programs and services for writers, visit our website at writersleague.org. Email us at wlt@writersleague.org or give us a call at 512-499-8914. Thank you for listening.